The world's most critical financial system is running on mathematics that professionals consider broken. To understand the actual stress on the system, we turn to a global survey of financial professionals and CFA charter holders analyzing the state of U.S. sovereign debt. The data reveals a stark split. 77% of surveyed professionals state that U.S. government finances are definitively unsustainable. Yet 59% of these same professionals observe that global investors remain highly confident in the U.S. Treasury's ability to freely borrow. This contradiction between broken domestic math and unshaken global confidence is a documented historical phenomenon known as the exorbitant privilege. Former French President Charles de Gaulle famously criticized this systemic advantage in the 1960s. His administration defined the privilege clearly: the unique ability of the United States to run persistent deficits because it issues the currency the rest of the world relies on for trade and reserves. Today, the United States is operating at crisis-level financial metrics, yet the market hasn't broken. We must deconstruct the macroeconomic data to map exactly how the system survives and calculate when this privilege will expire. The stability of global capital markets over the next decade depends on how long this structural tension can endure. We begin at the institutional source of the debt. The total outstanding debt issued by the U.S. federal government now exceeds $35 trillion. This chart plots the U.S. government debt to GDP ratio from 1940 to 2024. The current trajectory has crossed the 120% threshold, reaching debt levels not seen since the peak of World War II. This escalation is fueled by continuous budget deficits. The federal government has run a deficit every single year since the dot-com crisis in the early 2000s. When you carry a debt load of this magnitude, the interest obligations alone create a compounding effect, draining resources that could otherwise fund government operations. The situation is structurally entrenched. 61% of surveyed professionals conclude the U.S. will be unable to reduce its debt to GDP ratio to moderate levels in the next 5 to 15 years. Domestic fiscal policy is locked into a crisis trajectory. The math confirms the 77% consensus. The current path is mathematically unsustainable. If the domestic math points to a confirmed crisis, why hasn't there been a massive flight of capital away from the U.S. dollar? The primary psychological and structural force holding the system together is the TINA effect. There is no alternative. This matrix visualizes the 2023 debt and budget ratios of major global economies, demonstrating why alternatives are scarce. Japan carries a massive 266% debt to GDP ratio, making it an unviable safe haven. The European Union lacks a single, centralized sovereign debt equivalent to rival U.S. treasuries. China's debt to GDP is lower, but foreign ownership of their debt sits at a negligible 3%, failing as a liquid alternative. By comparison, the sheer size, robustness, and depth of U.S. capital markets create an inescapable gravitational pull for international investment. The exorbitant privilege survives because the U.S. remains the best-looking horse in the glue factory of global sovereign debt. Surviving the TINA effect does not mean the system is immune to decay. The foundation is actively eroding. We can track this decay through the decline in international appetite for funding U.S. government operations. This chart maps the percentage of U.S. federal debt held by foreign investors. Notice the steep decline. Foreign ownership peaked at 34% in 2012 and has steadily dropped to just 23.3% today. The second metric of erosion appears in the composition of global central bank coffers. This area chart tracks the U.S. dollar share of allocated foreign exchange reserves worldwide. The dollar's share hit a high of 71.5% in 2001. As central banks diversify, that share has fallen to roughly 59% today. This decline in reserve status is directly tied to the prolonged U.S. current account deficit. Importing more than it exports naturally bleeds U.S. currency into foreign hands. The combination of dropping foreign debt ownership and a shrinking reserve share proves that the exorbitant privilege is undergoing a slow, mathematically inevitable dilution. An international community is actively maneuvering in response to this slow erosion. The survey reveals a clear timeline consensus. 63% of financial professionals expect the U.S. dollar to lose its prominent reserve status over the next 5 to 15 years. That expectation is driven by a sharp geographic divide. The prediction jumps to 72% across BRICS nations and reaches 84% among professionals in India. Mainstream media often frames this transition as a single competing fiat currency plotting to take over the top spot. The data dismantles that narrative. Only 6% of professionals believe the Chinese renminbi will actually displace the dollar. Instead, 38% point to a fragmented, multipolar currency system. Digital currencies and gold tie for a distant second at 12% each. To delay this outcome, 69% of professionals indicate the U.S. government must immediately prioritize cutting non-mandatory discretionary spending. The exorbitant privilege is not facing a catastrophic overnight collapse. Buried under the weight of its own impossible math, it is facing a calculated, decades-long unwinding into global financial multipolarity.